Hey everyone, and welcome to my basing guide. In this video, we're going to talk about a bunch of different bases. We're going to talk about some of the rules you should follow, things you should think about, and finally some of the common mistakes that people make. I will make sure to timestamp all the different sections below so you can skip to them if you want, and let's get into it. Before we get into all the specific recalls, let's talk about what an ideal base looks like and the three things you should be thinking about when you're deciding whether or not to base. So this example here is actually going to show all three of them. So I'm going to show the example 3 times. So the first one is gold. When you're basing, you need to think a lot about like how much gold do you have and do you actually have a meaningful spike. So generally you don't want to base with too little gold, but you also don't want to base with too much gold. If you base with too little gold, you can't actually buy anything important, right? If you base with 300 gold, all you're really doing is getting a dagger or boots or something. It's just not that impactful, right? If you base with too much gold, that probably means you've been on the map for too long. So if you base with something like 2,000 gold, the problem is that you've actually missed quite a lot of pressure because you could have been on the map earlier with significant items. So generally, as just like a good kind of rule, it's good to base around 1,000 gold or so, assuming that you can get your spike, right? Like if you're waiting for last chapter, obviously you need to wait longer. But that's kind of like, I would think of it as like, if you have less than 500 gold, probably don't base. If you have 1,000 gold, start thinking about basing. If you have 1,500 gold, you're like definitely looking for a base. And if you have 2,000 gold, you basically need a base ASAP. So that's like a good framework for you. So if we look at this, right, I have enough gold to buy a meaningful spike. I base, I spend all my gold, and I buy this pickaxe. So it's a pretty nice bag. The second thing you need to think about, and a question you should actually ask yourself when you're going to recall, is can I realistically pressure with my resources? So the resources you want to think about are your HP, mana, and cooldowns. A lot of the time, it's really obvious. If you're like 30% HP and 30% mana, if you stay on the map, you can't really pressure. Sure, you can like stand in your tower and try catch some farm, but it's almost like being dead. You can't actually threaten the map, you can't pressure anything. So in that situation, it's really obvious if you want to recall. In this example here, it's a bit more difficult. If we have a look, I'm full HP, I have relatively low mana, and my cooldowns are a bit mixed. You know, I'm going to have ult, but I don't have ignite. So in this situation, when the answer is maybe, generally you should just recall. And the reason is going to be that, sure, maybe you can pressure the map at say 50% capacity. If you stay, if you base, you're off the map, you can't pressure it for a little bit, but when you come back, you're going to be able to pressure really hard. So if you're not sure about whether you can pressure the map or not, you probably should just base, but a lot of the time it's just like really obvious, like low HP, low mana, no cooldowns, just hit the base button straight away. And the last thing you want to consider when you're basing is, are you going to lose anything for this? In your ideal base, you don't want to lose any creeps for basing, and normally the way to do that is to either force your opponent to base first by chunking them out or by killing them or something like that. We'll go through a bunch of different examples of this, but in this situation, the enemy is always dead, right? So I'm not going to lose anything. I can just push in this wave, and you'll see here, I push it in, I recall, and then by the time I get back to this lane, I'm going to be able to clear all these creeps. So why is this the ideal base? Well, it's because I have a power spike that I want. It's because I know I can't really pressure the map if I stay, and because I'm not going to lose anything for it. So just keep those things in mind, those 3 things. To recap, it's your gold, it's your can you pressure, and are you going to lose anything? Keep those in mind when we talk about all the rest of the stuff in this video, because it's going to be super, super important. Let's get started with our specific bases. The first one is a very standard base, and probably one that you've encountered all before. This is by far the most common base, and the one you're going to want to use the most, which is where you force your opponent to base first, either by killing them or chunking them out, and then pushing away before basing yourself. This does a few things for you. One, it allows you to base with slightly more gold than your opponent because you got to shove an extra wave. It also denies them the wave, so while they're basing, they're going to lose it. And of course, it allows you to refill your HP and mana, and on top of that, you're not going to lose anything because by the time you get back, as you'll see here, like even if your opponent hard shoves a wave, you're going to get back here in time to clear it. So you're able to not lose any creeps for it. So again, this is your most standard base and probably the one you're going to look for the most, but of course, like you're not going to be able to get this all the time. But yeah, really look for that. If your opponent bases first, most of the time you do want to push the wave before basing, again, to allow yourself not to miss any creeps and to deny them creeps on top of it. Sometimes you actually want to match base with your opponent. You want to base at the same time as them. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the main one is if you don't have the wave clear, either because you lack the mana or you just lack the damage in order to push the wave in time. So this is very common on champs like LeBlanc, or if you're playing melees that have very poor wave clear, like Akali is an example. A lot of the time, you just don't have the wave clear in order to push it in time before your opponent gets back to lane. So in this case, it's because I don't have mana, but you know, on those champs, you just won't have the wave clear. If you try and push this, your opponent's just going to get back to lane in time that they can actually freeze the wave on their side, and you've just set up a pushing wave for them. So if you're the one that's like losing the matchup, or you just don't have the wave clear or anything like that, you'll probably want to match base rather than pushing it in if they base first. The other reason you might want to do this is because if you push a wave, before basing, they will actually get one wave of priority when they come back to lane. So if you saw in that previous replay, the Kassadin was able to push out that wave before I got back to lane. Now, normally this is not a problem, so I wouldn't think about it too much, but if you're versus a very heavy roaming champion like Talon or something like that, you might not want to give up that one wave of priority. There are definitely some exceptions to that, and I'm going to talk about that later in the video, but that's another thing to be aware of. The main reason, though, is just that it's really scary to push and then get frozen on. Basing before your opponent can do a lot of good things too. So the first one is that, again, you get that wave of priority. If you base, your opponent pushes an extra wave, you will have an opportunity to push a wave while they're basing. So this can be really good in matchups where you can't really get priority, or it can be really useful on roaming champions where when they get a wave of priority, they can do a lot with it. You can also sometimes use it to set up a freeze. So if you know your opponent doesn't have enough wave clear, if you're, again, versus one of those really weak wave clear melee champs in the early game, you can just base first and then come back, set up a freeze, and they can't really break it. And the last thing you can do with it is you can actually use it to abuse spike differences in matchups. So if you take an example like this, Ryze versus Syndra. Syndra spikes very hard on big AP items. You know, we're talking like maybe Blasting 1 for 850, we're talking like Lost Chapter for 1300, maybe Stork Shoes at 1100, right? Ryze, on the other hand, functions very well on low gold spikes. So he can buy a tier, he can buy a Dark Seal, he can go boots plus Negatron Cloak or something like that, right? There's a lot of things that you can do. So in this matchup, Syndra really wants the lane to kind of go on for a long time. She wants her base to be higher gold, whereas Ryze wants it to be on low gold. Here, I start my base. If Syndra doesn't, if Syndra doesn't match, she will push in, I will come back, TP, and then I will get a wave of prior. That's great because I'm a roaming champion. If she matches me at the same time because she doesn't want me to roam, which is what she's going to do here, I'm actually going to come back in a more favorable state than she is, because what's going to happen is, sure, I got tier boots, Syndra got tier Dark Seal. Guess who this is better for? It's much better for the champion that's meant to lose the matchup, which is the Ryze, especially because now Syndra doesn't really have the ability to actually contest me. So basing first is honestly quite advanced, but it has a lot of really good things, especially if you're playing a losing matchup or you're playing a roaming champion. So if you've fallen behind or you're in a bad matchup or for whatever reason you can't really control the lane, it's quite difficult to get a good base. And what people used to say is that the way you get out of this situation is you try base on the wave before a cannon wave, but this is actually bad advice now. So the way it used to work is that the reason you would base on the wave before a cannon wave was because if you cleared out the second wave and then instantly based, it would take your opponent a long time to crash that cannon wave, and then the cannon would tank a lot of shots in the tower, so you could actually get back to mid wave without losing too much. But the reason this has kind of become bad advice is for two reasons. One, the existence of turret plates. So if your opponent can stay, they can actually just keep ordering your tower, and as long as they have a cannon there, they can maybe get 2 plates for it. So even though you don't lose that much CS, you're going to give your opponent so much gold that it's almost not worth it. The second reason is actually the existence of DMAT. So not that many people take DMAT, so you can sometimes get away with it, but a lot of the times in competitive people do, and it just allows you to instantly DMAT a cannon, and then suddenly you just lose that entire wave. So in my opinion, basing before a cannon is not really much of a thing anymore, and there's a much better way to do it. If you're in a losing matchup like this, you've fallen behind, again, it's quite difficult. You want to pay a lot of attention to both the wave that's currently here as well as the next wave. And the situation you're trying to create is you want some of this wave to be left alive and this wave to be close enough that your opponent's actually going to have to push 2 waves rather than 1. So I'll show you the example. What I realize here is that Syndra doesn't have enough time to push this wave before this next wave comes out. Basically, this next wave is going to reach this point here before she's able to push it in. If she chooses to freeze instead, I'm just going to be able to come back with an item advantage. So she probably doesn't want to do that. She could possibly come here and base, but then if she does that, I might be able to come here and just push it in with my ult. So in this situation, it's quite difficult for her. She doesn't quite know what to do. And as you can see, by the time she realizes that I'm basing, my wave is actually past the tower. And what that is going to mean is that it's going to take her too long to push this wave, and I'm actually going to be able to come back and end up not missing any creeps. So again, this one is quite advanced. It definitely takes some time to get used to, but basically what you're looking for, you're trying to wait in lane long enough that your next wave is going to come out and be in front of your tower before they like realize you're recalling, basically. If they realize too soon, they can just one-shot the wave and it crashes and then you just lose everything, right? But if you do it just right, you know this wave is going to pass the tower, she's not going to be able to push in time, and that allows you to come back and get all the CS. Basing with a freeze can be really, really powerful. So in this example here, the enemy rises right? Like he has the base, and I could just let him crash the wave, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm actually going to pull up the wave. Now, this is a really common mistake I see here. I either see one of two mistakes. One, people just let this wave crash, and then your opponent just bases, and they're absolutely fine, right? They don't have to TP, they can just walk back to lane. The second one is that you decide to push this wave. If you don't push this fast enough, the enemy just like comes back to, again, a frozen wave, and you're kind of you just can't really do anything. So in this situation, like Yon doesn't have the greatest wave clear. I know I can't push this wave in time, but also I don't want to let it crash because I really want to force out Ryze's TP. So what do I do instead? I actually pull up the wave and then I match base. What this is going to do is it's going to force Ryze to TP back to the lane, or he's going to lose all these creeps. As you can see here, he TP's back and I'm just able to match TP. So you have to be, you really guys, actually this more than anything is one you have to pay attention to. I see this so much. In this situation, please don't push it under their tower and please don't let it push under your tower. Just pull the wave and freeze and match base instead. If you want to understand basing at a pretty high level, you also need to know about teleport, because teleport actually changes the way bases work and how the lane plays out quite a lot. So the way teleport kind of functions is it's used as a second health bar. The reason is that TP will refill your corrupting pots, your refillable, everything like that. Obviously, you can buy more sustain if you want. It completely refills your HP and mana. And it also just acts as a really fast base. So TP is probably the best laning sum, much better than any of the others, but it's quite difficult to use. So there's like three matchups we can get, right? We can get TP versus TP, where both mid laners have TP. We can have you having TP versus your opponent having no TP, and you can have you with no TP versus your opponent with TP. So this example here, I am playing TP versus no TP. I'm against a Yasuo who does not have it. When you have TP advantage, when your opponent doesn't have it, a lot of the time you will want to base first and TP back. What this is going to do for you is it's going to allow you to freeze the wave with item advantage. So you can see here, I base and I'm able to come back and freeze, and I have health and item advantage. So what happens is it becomes really, really difficult for Yasuo to actually play the game. I can just pull the wave, I have Thresh nearby, I can have my jungler come mid, and he's in a very, very tough position. So this is why at a high level, everyone takes TP. And because like if you verse someone with no TP, it's very, very difficult. Like TP, it just makes such a big difference for lane. So if you're TP versus no TP, most of the time you're looking to base first when you have a spike, TP back, freeze the wave with health and item advantage, and try to keep that perma frozen. In a TP versus TP matchup, there's a few things you can do. So this is an example you actually saw earlier in the video, but let's talk about it from the TP point of view. So again, I'm playing TP Ryze versus TP Syndra. So when you're playing against another TP champ, most of the time you will want to base at the same time as them. So if you take this as an example, right, what would happen if I tried to push this wave? Well, what would happen is I would start pushing it, I'd use some of my mana on it, and then Syndra would just TP back with her item advantage, and then it would be really difficult for me to crash that. Even though I have TP, I'd be forced to walk away from the wave, complete my full base, and then TP back, and during that time, I'd probably lose most of the waves. So it can be quite difficult to push in a wave against the TP user if they have it up. The exception would be if you can keep them under tower, like if they're so close to tower that you have time to push it before they can TP back to the wave, you can do that, because like this is an old replay, so you could still TP to creeps, but nowadays you can't do that. So if you can get the wave close enough to the tower that they can't actually get out and freeze it in time, you can still do that. But most of the time, you'll be wanting to match TP, or you will want to match base with them if you both have TP. The other thing you can do in TP versus TP matchups is actually slow push the waves. So I'll show you an example here. In this matchup, I'm quite ahead of Malzahar in the 1v1, and I'm kind of freezing the wave. Now, what would happen here? I know Malzahar is basing, right? So if I choose to match base, I will probably have to base in TP. And the reason for that is if I don't base in TP, this wave is just going to shove out, right? And I'm going to end up losing the creeps. So if I want to actually keep my TP, what I have to do is actually slow push instead. And what that's going to do is it's going to build the wave up so big that Malzahar is actually not going to be able to hold it, even if he has an item advantage. So if I had just base TP right now, I would be able to shove in the wave, but then eventually my opponent would have TP advantage over me. So this is probably not something you're going to run into super often, honestly, but as you can see, I'm just like slow pushing out this wave, and eventually it's going to be big enough that once it actually crashes to Malzahar, it's too big that he can't hold it. And what that means is I can base and then save my TP. So this is, I don't know if that made sense, to be completely honest with you guys. If it didn't make sense, like comment below. But the gist of it is that like if you're freezing in a matchup where you both have TP, you really don't want to use your TP and have your opponent not use your TP. And in that situation, if you can't push it fast enough because you don't have enough wave clear or you just don't have the mana or whatever, you can actually look to slow push it instead. If you're the one playing with no TP TP versus someone that does have TP, you're kind of almost always forced into basing first. The reason is, again, that otherwise your opponent can just base and then TP back to lane. So it's kind of the trade-off that you make. Like if you have a combat summoner, generally you have better all-in and you have better skirmishes, but you're almost always going to have worse bases than your opponent. So you can see here, I am unfortunately forced to lose some of these creeps. Obviously not too many. It's definitely not the end of the world. And on a lot of champs, it actually is like worth it to give up some creeps, right? To have a combat sum. So I guess like that's really just be aware of the fact that if you have TP, or sorry, if you don't have TP versus someone that does TP, it's going to be very difficult for you to get good bases. And most likely you're just going to have to base at a convenient opportunity before they do. Let's move on to some mid-game bases and common mistakes I see in the mid-game. So the first one that you need to think about in the mid-game is timing your bases around objective spawns. So objectives like Dragon, Baron, and Herald are pretty much always where the game is decided in solo queue. It normally comes down to some big 5v5, so it's really important that you're as strong as possible for these times. And a good rule, and a good kind of habit to get into, is to try base around a minute 15 to around a minute before the objective spawns. What that is going to do for you is it's going to allow you to spend all your gold, fill up your HP and mana, and also be back in time to contest the dragon. Basically, it's just going to mean you're as strong as you possibly can be for the dragon. And it's also going to mean that you actually get to the dragon in time to actually contest it. You have to be careful because if you base too early, you're actually going to miss a lot of farm. But if you base too late, you're not going to get to the dragon in order to control the area before it spawns. So in this example, you actually see that this is a competitive, or a scrim, I guess. It's still a competitive game that we're playing. You actually see that a lot of our team is like synced up on their recalls. So Varus, Alistair, and me all recalling at the same time. And then we all come back on the map at the same time. And we're ready here to contest this dragon before it spawns. You see, like, we've all spent our gold, we're all as strong as we can possibly be before this dragon is spawning, and it's going to make it impossible for the enemy team to contest it. So that's habit number one. Try and base, spend all your gold, regen, all your like mana, HP, whatever, around a minute 15 before that objective spawns. That way you will be there in time to control the dragon area, and you will be as strong as you can possibly be for that fight. Another thing to consider when you're basing is to try and base around spikes. So don't just base around like random gold values. So as I said earlier in the video, you know, there's some kind of gold values that you can think about basing on, but you really want to be basing with a specific item in mind. So here I'm basing with Blighting Jewel in mind, and also the dragon is spawning soon, which makes this a really good base. A really common mistake I see in the mid game is people basing too often. They're actually basing for spikes that don't really matter. You know, they might just base and buy an Am Tome or something like that. Generally, that's going to be quite bad, and you really want to make your bases worth it, because every time you base, you're off the map for a significant amount of time, right? So you only really want to base when you're actually getting something that's really worth it. So yeah, try and think about what you're actually basing for. Is it like a worthwhile spike for basing? Yeah, because like really try and get out of the habit of basing like every like 2 minutes or something, because you just end up losing so much time on the map that could be farming, it could be pressuring, or just doing something like that. Just like in the early game, if you can't actually pressure the map, you just need to base. So if you look at this here, I mean, I'm basing with some pretty mediocre items. I'm probably getting like a Fiendish Codex, or maybe like a, I don't know, an Am Tome and a Ruby Crystal. It's going to be something pretty mediocre here, right? But the problem is I just can't pressure the map. If you look at this, I'm like 40% health. My mana is not that great. I have no ult, no flash, no ignite. If I stay on the map here, again, I might as well be dead. I'm just not really doing anything. So even though this base isn't that great, just because of like spikes and stuff like that, I'm kind of forced into it because otherwise I just can't pressure the map. And there's pretty much nothing worse than staying on the map but not actually being able to do anything. It ends up just being a waste of time and delaying actually being able to get back on the map and start to properly pressure again. If you can, you actually want to sync your bases and your pressure with your team. Now this is quite hard to do in solo queue, but I figured I'd add it in because it's still sort of important. If your team is doing something, you generally want to do it with them. So a really common situation of this is after Baron. If your team immediately wants to pressure with Baron, you probably want to pressure with them. If you base, they're not going to be able to do anything until you actually come back. At the same time, if your team wants to base, you probably shouldn't be pressuring because your entire team is going to be in base. So Baron is the really obvious one, and I think it's definitely the most important one. So try and sync your bases with your team a little bit. Obviously, again, it is quite difficult to do in solo queue, but I think around those objective timers, like what you do after is really, really important. So try and think about what your team is doing and try sync up your bases and pressure with them. The last thing I want to bring up for the mid game is actually don't base too soon after a fight. So after you win a fight, normally that gives you like a brief window of where you can do stuff before your opponents respawn. So one like big mistake I see is that even though it looks like a good base after you win a fight because you have gold, you have low HP. The thing is, normally you can get a little bit more. So like you win a dragon fight and you might be able to push a wave and then base, or you win a dragon fight and you might be able to take a couple camps before you base. You know, it just gives you that little window where you can get a bit more. Obviously, if you kill lots of people, you can look to do Baron or something like that. But yeah, it can be really tempting just to instantly base after one fight, but normally it's bad. You have a little bit of time where you can just get a bit more, and that's like a really important part of the mid game of just like converting what are just kills into a bigger advantage, you know, towers, camps, waves, etc. So guys, that's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you did learn a thing or two. I think basing is pretty advanced, honestly. There's like a lot of exceptions and a lot of different scenarios, especially in the laning phase. But I think as long as you like keep those core kind of concepts in mind of like, you know, think about how much gold you have, like what spikes you're playing for, can you realistically pressure the map, you know, how much are we going to lose for this base, that sort of stuff, I think that'll make a big difference. I also think basing in the mid game is not super hard, so that's like a really easy place to immediately improve. Like I see really common mistakes, as I said, of people just like having 2,000 gold at a dragon fight. I think that's like super easy to fix and makes a really big difference. And that's the thing about like basing in general, is obviously like you can get a lot out of basing if you're really, really good at it, right? But you can actually get quite a lot out of basing by just being average at it. You know, if you just know some basic bases and your opponent doesn't, it actually goes a really long way. So yeah, if you have any questions about any of that, please leave them in the comment section below. I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, if you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.